Page 546. Section H. What's Wrong with the CIA? By Tom Braden. From Saturday Review, April 5th, 1975. We are gathered, 4 of us, CIA division chiefs and deputies, in the office of our agency's director, an urbane and charming man. He is seated at his desk, puffing nervously on his pipe and asking us questions. Alan Dulles is fretting on this morning in the early 50s, as indeed he has fretted most mornings. You can't be in the middle of building an enormous spy house, running agents into Russia and elsewhere, worrying about Joseph McCarthy, planning to overthrow a government in Guatemala, and helping to elect another in Italy without fretting. But on this particular morning, Dulles is due for an appearance before Senator Richard B. Russell's Armed Services Committee, and the question he is pondering as he puffs on his pipe is whether to tell the senators what is making him fret. He has just spent a lot of money on buying an intelligence network, and the network has turned out to be worthless. In fact, it's a little worse than worthless. All that money, Dulles now suspects, went to the KGB. Therefore, the questions are somber, and so are the answers. At last, Dulles rises. Quote, "Well," end quote, he says. Quote, "I guess I'll have to fudge the truth a little," end quote. His eyes twinkle at the word fudge, then suddenly turn serious. He twists his slightly stooped shoulders into the old tweeded topcoat and heads for the door, but he turns back. Quote, "I'll tell the truth to Dick, in brackets, Russell, end brackets," end quote. He says, quote, "I always do," end quote. Then the twinkle returns, and he adds with a chuckle, quote, "That is, if Dick wants to know," end quote. The reason I recall the above scene in detail is that lately I have been asking myself what's wrong with the CIA. 2 committees of Congress and 1 from the executive branch are asking the question too, but they are asking out of a concern for national policy. I am asking for a different reason. I once worked for the CIA. I regard the time I spent there as worthwhile duty. I look back upon the men with whom I worked as able and honorable. So for me, the question, quote, "What's wrong with the CIA?" end quote, is both personal and poignant. Old friends of mine have been caught in evasions or worse. People I worked with have violated the law. Men whose ability I respected have planned operations that ended in embarrassment or disaster. What's wrong with these people? What's wrong with the CIA? Ask yourself a question often enough, and sometimes the mind will respond with a memory. The memory my mind reported back is that scene in Alan Dulles' office. It seemed at first blush a commonplace, inconsequential episode. But the more it fixed itself in my mind, the more it seemed to me that it helped to answer my question about what's wrong with the agency. Let me explain. End of page 546. Beginning page 547. The first thing this scene reveals is the sheer power that Dulles and his agency had. Only a man with extraordinary power could make a mistake involving a great many of the taxpayers' dollars and not have to explain it. Alan Dulles had extraordinary power. Power flowed to him and through him to the CIA, partly because his brother was Secretary of State, partly because his reputation as the master spy of World War II hung over him like a mysterious halo, partly because his senior partnership in the prestigious New York law firm how Sullivan and Cromwell impressed the small-town lawyers of Congress. Moreover, events helped keep power flowing. The country was fighting a shooting war in Korea and a Cold War in Western Europe, and the CIA was sole authority on the plans and potential of the real enemy. To argue against the CIA was to argue against knowledge. Only Joseph McCarthy would run such a risk. Indeed, McCarthy unwittingly added to the power of the CIA. He attacked the agency, and when, in the showdown, Dulles won, victory vastly increased the respectability of what people then called, quote, the cause, end quote, of anti-communism. Quote, don't join the book burners, end quote, Eisenhower had said. That was the bad way to fight communism. The good way was the CIA. Power was the thing that went wrong with the CIA. There was too much of it, and it was too easy to bring to bear on the State Department and on other government agencies, on the patriotic businessmen of New York, and on the foundations whose directorships they occupied. The agency's power overwhelmed the Congress, the press, and therefore the people. I'm not saying that this power didn't help to win the Cold War, and I believe the Cold War was a good war to win, but the power enabled the CIA to continue Cold War operations 10 and 15 years after the Cold War was won. Under Allen Dulles, the power was unquestioned, and after he left, the habit of not questioning remained. I remember the time I walked over to the State Department to get formal approval for some CIA project involving a few $100,000 and a publication in Europe. The desk man at the State Department balked. Imagine, he balked, and at an operation designed to combat what I knew for certain was a similar Soviet operation. I was astonished, but I didn't argue. I knew what would happen. I would report to the director, who would get his brother on the phone. Quote, Foster, one of your people seems to be a little less than cooperative, end quote. That is power. The second thing that's wrong with the CIA is arrogance. And the scene I've mentioned above shows that too. Allen Dulles' private joke about, quote, fudging, end quote, was arrogant. And so was the suggestion that, quote, Dick, end quote, might not want to know. An organization that does not have to answer for mistakes is certain to become arrogant. It is not a cardinal sin, this fault, and sometimes it squints toward virtue. It might be argued, for example, that only arrogant men would insist on building the U-2 spy plane within a time frame which military experts said could not be met. Yet in the days before satellite surveillance, the U-2 spy plane was the most useful means of keeping the peace. It assured this country's leaders that Russia was not planning. To page 547, beginning page 548, an attack. But if arrogance built the plane quickly, it also destroyed it. For surely it was arrogant to keep it flying through Soviet airspace after it was suspected that the Russians were literally zeroing in on overflying U-2s. I wonder whether the arrogance of the CIA may not have been battlefield related, a holdover from World War II, machismo, and daring do. The leaders of the agency were, almost to a man, veterans of OSS, the CIA's wartime predecessor. Take, for example, the men whose faces I now recall standing there in the director's office. One had run a spy and operations network into Germany, from German-occupied territory. Another had volunteered to parachute into Field Marshal Kesselring's headquarters grounds with terms for his surrender. A third had landed in Norway, and, having lost half his men, came up nevertheless, blowing up bridges. OSS men who became CIA men were unusual people who had volunteered to carry out unusual orders and to take unusual risks. Moreover, they were impressed more than most soldiers can be impressed with the absolute necessity for secrecy and the certain penalty that awaited the breach of it. But they had another quality that set them apart. For some reason that psychologists could perhaps explain, a man who volunteers to go on extremely dangerous mission, alone or with one or two helpers, is likely to not be only brave and resourceful, but also somewhat vain. Relatively few men volunteered to jump into Germany or Japanese territory during World War II. Those who did volunteer were conscious that they were, in a word, quote, different, end quote. Once these men had landed behind the lines, the difference took on outward symbols. They were alone, Americans in a country full of French or Greek or Italians or Chinese. Often they were treated with great respect. Sometimes as mere lieutenants, they commanded thousands of men. At a word from them, American or British planes came over to drop supplies to these men. They earned the love and respect that conquered people felt for the great democracy called America. Inevitably, they began to think of themselves individually and collectively as representing the national honor. Is it not possible that men who have learned to do everything in secrecy, who are accustomed to strange assignments, and who think of themselves as embodying their country, are peculiarly susceptible to imperial presidencies such as those of Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon? Have they not, in fact, trained themselves to behave as a power elite? To power and to arrogance, and the mystique of the inside-out syndrome. That syndrome in the director's office defines the problem. Dulles was leveling with his assistants, and they were leveling with him, an agent or a station chief or an official of the CIA who didn't level, who departed in the slightest degree from a faithful account of what he knew or what he had done, was a danger to operations and to lives. Such a man couldn't last a day in the CIA. But truth was reserved for the inside. To the outsider, CIA men learned to lie consciously and deliberately without the slightest twinge of the guilt that most men feel when they tell a deliberate lie. The inside-out syndrome is unavoidable in a secret intelligence. End of page 548, beginning page 549. Agency. You bring a group of people together, bind them with an oath, test their loyalty periodically with machines, spy on them to make sure they're not meeting secretly with someone from the Czech embassy, cushion them from the rest of the world with a false cover story, teach them to lie because lying is in the national interest, and they do not behave like other men. They do not come home from work and answer truthfully the question, quote, "What did you do today, darling?" end quote. When they chat with their neighbors, they lie about their jobs. In their compartmentalized need-to-know jobs, it is perfectly excusable for one CIA man to lie to another if the other doesn't need to know. Thus it was a ritual for Allen Dulles to, quote, fudge, end quote, and often he didn't have to. Senator Russell might say, quote, the chairman has conferred with the director about this question, which touches a very sensitive matter, end quote. The question would be withdrawn. Another technique for dealing with an outsider was the truthful non-response. Consider the following exchange between Senator Claiborne Pell, DRI, and Richard Helms. The exchange was concerned with spying on Americans, an illegal act under the terms of the law that created the CIA. Senator Pell, referring to spying on anti-war demonstrations, quote, but these all occurred within the continental shores of the United States, and for that reason you had the justifiable reason to decline, in brackets, to end brackets, move in there because the events were outside your ambit, end quote. Mr. Helms, quote, absolutely, and I have never been lacking in clarity in my mind since I have been director, that this is simply not acceptable, not only to Congress, but to the public of the United States, end quote. No doubt that answer was truthful. No doubt Helms did think that domestic spying was not acceptable, but he was doing it, and he didn't say he wasn't. Finally, of course, there is the direct lie. Here is another excerpt from 1973 testimony by Helms. Senator Symington, DMO. So just to pause and as a brief reading. Senator Stuart Symington, if that's him. He's a senator from Missouri and is a Democrat. So I assume that's what that abbreviation meant. And the one referring to Senator Pell he's a Democrat from Rhode Island. That's all. I'm not sure, but I'm going to resume the reading. Senator Symington, quote, did you try in the Central Intelligence Agency to overthrow the government of Chile, end quote. Helms, quote, no, sir, end quote. Symington, quote, did you have any money passed to the opponents of Allende, end quote. Helms, quote, no, sir, end quote. Helms was under oath, therefore he must have considered his answer carefully. Obviously, he came to the insider's conclusion that his duty to protect the inside outweighed his outsider's oath. Or to put it in another way, the law of the inside comes first. Allen Dulles once remarked that if necessary, he would lie to anybody about the CIA except the president. Quote, I never had the slightest qualms about lying to an outsider, end quote. A CIA veteran remarked recently, quote, why does an outsider need to know, end quote. So much for the lessons of memory. Power, arrogance, and the inside-outside syndrome are what's wrong with the CIA, and to some extent the faults are occupational and even necessary tools for the job. But the events of the Cold War and the coincidence of Allen Dulles' having such enormous discretionary powers enlarged occupational risks until they became faults, and the faults created a monstrosity. End of page 549, beginning page 550. Power built a vast bureaucracy and a ridiculous monument in Langley, Virginia. Arrogance fostered the belief that a few hundred exiles could land on a beach and hold off Castro's army. The inside-out syndrome withheld the truth from Adlai Stevenson, so that he was forced to make a spectacle of himself on the floor of the United Nations by denying that the United States had anything to do with the invasion of Cuba. The same syndrome had made a sad and worried man of Richard Helms. It's a shame what happened to the CIA. It could have consisted of a few hundred scholars to analyze intelligence, a few hundred spies in key positions, and a few hundred operators ready to carry out rare tasks of daring do. Instead, it became a gargantuan monster, owning property all over the world, running airplanes and newspapers and radio stations and banks and armies and navies, offering temptation to successive secretaries of state and giving at least one president a brilliant idea. Since the machinery for deceit existed, why not use it? Richard Helms should have said no to Richard Nixon, but as a victim of the inside-out syndrome, Helms could only ask Watergate's most plaintive question, quote, "Who would have thought that it would someday be judged a crime to carry out the orders of the President of the United States?" End quote. A shame, and a peculiarly American shame. For this is the only country in the world which doesn't recognize the fact that some things are better if they are small. We need intelligence. We'll need intelligence in the future. And once in a great while, we may need covert action too. But at the moment, we have nothing. The revelations of Watergate and the investigations that have followed have done their work. The CIA's power is gone. Its arrogance has turned to fear. The inside-out syndrome has been broken. Former agents write books naming other agents. Director William Colby goes to the Justice Department with evidence that his predecessor violated the law. The house that Allen Dulles built is divided and torn. The end is not in sight. Various committees now investigating the agency will doubtless find error. They will recommend change. They will reshuffle. They will adjust. But they will leave the monster intact, and even if the monster never makes another mistake, never again overreaches itself, even indeed if, like some other government agencies, it never does anything at all, it will, by existing, go right on creating and perpetuating the myths that always accompanied the presence of the monster. We know the myths. They circulate throughout the land wherever there are bars and bowling alleys. That the CIA killed John Kennedy. That the CIA crippled George Wallace. That an unexplained airplane crash, a big gold heist, were all the work of the CIA. These myths are ridiculous, but they will exist as long as the monster exists. The fact that millions believe the myths raises once again the old question which OSS men used to argue after the war. Can a free and open society engage in covert operations? After nearly 30 years of trial, the evidence ought to be brought in. The evidence demonstrates, it seems to me, that a free and open society cannot. End of page 550, beginning page 551. Engage in covert operations, not at any rate in the kind of large, intricate covert operations of which the CIA has been capable. I don't argue solely from the box score, but let's look at the box score. It reveals many famous failures. Too easily they prove the point. Consider what the CIA deems its known successes. Does anybody remember Arbenz in Guatemala? What good was achieved by the overthrow of Arbenz? Would it really have made any difference to this country if we hadn't thrown our bends? And Allende, how much good did it do the American people to overthrow Allende? How much bad? Was it essential, even granted the sticky question of succession, to keep those Greek colonies in power for so long? We used to think that it was a great triumph that the CIA kept the Shah of Iran on his throne against the onslaught of Mossadegh. Are we grateful still? The uprisings during the last phase of the Cold War and those dead bodies in the streets of Poland, East Germany, and Hungary, to what avail? But the box score does not tell the whole story. We paid a high price for that box score. Shame and embarrassment is a high price. Doubt, mistrust, and fear is a high price. The public myths are a high price, and so is the guilty knowledge that we own an establishment devoted to opposing the ideals we profess. In our midst, we have maintained a secret instrument erected in contradiction to James Madison's injunction, quote, "A popular government without the means to popular information is a farce or a tragedy, perhaps both," end quote. As I say, the investigating committees will prop the monster up. I would suggest more radical action. I would shut it down. I would turn the overt intelligence function over to the State Department. Scholars and scientists and people who understand how the railroads run in Sri Lanka don't need to belong to the CIA in order to do their valuable work well. I would turn the paratroopers over to the Army. If at some time it becomes essential to our survival to mount a secret attack upon a foe, the Army is capable of doing it, and, with some changes in command structure in order to bypass bureaucracy, the Army could do it as swiftly and secretly as the CIA. Under the command structure of the Department of Defense, congressional oversight would be possible. Then, if the Army got caught fielding a secret division in Laos, and if the American people did not want a secret division in Laos, the American people would know where to turn. I would turn the psychological warriors and propagandists over to the Voice of America. Psychological warriors and propagandists probably never did belong in a secret agency. And last, I would choose a very few men to run spies and such covert operations as the passage of money to those in other lands who cannot afford to accept American support openly. But I would limit covert operations to passing money to, quote, friendlies, end quote. I would house these spy masters and money passers in some obscure tool shed, and I would forbid by law any of them from ever calling. End of page 551, beginning page 552. Himself, quote, director, end quote. They would not work for the CIA because I would abolish the name CIA. As their chief, the president should choose for a term of 6 years some civilian who has demonstrated staunchness of character and independence of mind. I would make him responsible to a joint committee of Congress as well as to the president, and I would not permit him to serve more than one term. Thus we might get rid of power. Without power, arrogance would not be dangerous. Thus, too, we could prevent the inside-out syndrome, so essential to secrecy, from making a mockery of representative government. As for the house that Allen Dulles built at Langley, we might leave it to standing empty, our only national monument to the value that democracy places upon the recognition and correction of a mistake. End of page 552. Beginning page 553. 1. Recommendations of the Commission on the Organization of the Government for the Conduct of Foreign Policy, the Murphy Commission, concerning covert action. Covert action, a special problem. To this point, we have addressed only the intelligence activities of the intelligence community. But in addition to those endeavors, the community, specifically CIA, has also been responsible for another activity which poses special problems of oversight and control. This is covert action, activity abroad intended not to gather information, but to influence events, an activity midway between diplomacy and war. It has taken many forms, from the financial support of friendly publications to the mounting of significant paramilitary efforts. The Commission has considered whether covert action should any longer be authorized at all. It recognizes that there are many risks and dangers associated with covert action. Partly for these reasons, the use of covert action in recent years has markedly declined. But we must live in the world we find, not the world we might wish. Our adversaries deny themselves no forms of action which might advance their interests or undercut ours, as quite recent as well as past events demonstrate. In many parts of the world, a prohibition on our use of covert action would put the U.S. and those who rely on it at a dangerous disadvantage. We conclude, therefore, that covert action cannot be abandoned, but that it should be employed only where clearly essential to vital U.S. purposes, and then only after a careful process of high-level review. The current process for approval of covert action involves the submission of proposals to the 40 Committee. The committee approves or disapproves its chairman, the assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, issues appropriate instructions. In recent years, however, as authorizations have decreased in number, the procedures of the committee have become quite informal, and it has met infrequently. We believe present practices are inadequate. The sensitivity and risks of covert action require appropriate review and consultation. The committee therefore proposes that covert action should only be authorized after collective consideration of its benefits and risks by all available 40 committee members, and that, besides granting initial approvals, the 40 Committee should regularly review the continuing appropriations of activities still being pursued. In addition to requiring careful review within the executive branch, the Commission believes that covert action should be reported to the end of page 553, beginning page 554. Joint Committee of the Congress on National Security proposed in Chapter 14. We also believe that the current requirement of law that the President personally certify to the Congress the necessity for all covert actions, the Hughes Amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act of 1947, PL 93-559, is harmful in associating the head of state so formally with such activities. We propose, therefore, that PL 93-559 be amended to require reporting of covert actions, to be proposed Joint Committee on National Security, and to omit any requirement for the personal certification of the President as to their necessity. End of page 554. Beginning page 555. Appendix 3. Soviet Intelligence Collection and Operations Against the United States. A. Section A. Introduction. The USSR conducts espionage and, quote, active measures, end quote, or covert action operations on a large scale against its main enemy, the United States. Footnote 1. Pausing the reading to read footnote 1. The People's Republic of China is now almost as important a target to the Soviet Union as is the United States. Resuming the reading. These activities are carried out in the U.S. and abroad by the Soviet intelligence and security services, the KGB and the GRU, and by the intelligence and security services of Soviet-influenced Eastern European countries, via their officers and agents in the United States and in other countries. The main targets are U.S. government officials, members of the business, scientific, and political communities with access to the U.S. government and other influential entities such as youth, journalists, and trade organizations. According to the CIA, the United States is still the major target of the Soviet Union. Soviet intelligence and security services regard a greater degree of contact between the United States and the USSR, resulting from detent both as an increased counterintelligence threat and as an opportunity for recruitment of more intelligence sources. Subsection 1. General Structure and Command. The intelligence and security structure of the Soviet Union today consists of two main elements. The first is the Committee of State Security, known in the USSR and abroad by its initials, KGB. The second element is the lesser-known Military Intelligence Organization, the Chief Directorate of Intelligence of the General Staff, whose initials are GRU. Both of these organizations operate on a worldwide basis. There is no Soviet embassy abroad which does not have its contingent of KGB officers, and it is doubtful whether there are more than one or two without GRU officers. Furthermore, the diplomatically accredited personnel in Soviet embassies are generally from 40% to 60% GRU and KGB officers. However, while there are many similarities between the operations of these two organizations overseas, there is one basic difference between them. GRU engages in only foreign intelligence collection and has no domestic functions. The KGB, however, exists to safeguard national security. It interprets this mandate in the broadest sense, and therefore both its foreign activities and its domestic mission are multifaceted. The KGB and GRU are nominally controlled by the Soviet government, but are actually commanded by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, CPSU. Officially, both intelligence services report to the Council of Ministers of the Soviet government. The KGB reports. End of page 555. Beginning page 556. Directly, and the GRU through the General Staff of the Ministry of Defense. It appears that the role of the Council of Ministers in overseeing these organizations is limited to administrative control, while the actual control of operations is a party function. Both organizations report indirectly and directly to the CPSU leadership through their respective chiefs. Yuri Vladimirovich Andropov, chairman of the KGB, and Marshal Andrei Antonovich Grechko, Minister of Defense. Both are full voting members of the Politburo, the highest ruling body of the CPSU. Subsection 2. Budget. Accurate estimates of Soviet expenditures on intelligence are difficult to arrive at because of rigid security and because of the peculiar activities of Soviet accounting practices. The available evidence indicates that both the KGB and GRU receive high priority in the allocation of funds and other resources. Subsection 3. The Soviet Intelligence and Security Services, the KGB. As noted above, the KGB has both domestic and foreign functions. Abroad, the KGB is responsible for the collection of foreign intelligence, for the control of all official Soviet installations and personnel, for the penetration of all hostile intelligence and security services, and for conducting covert and executive action and programs. However, it concentrates a far greater share of its attention on its internal functions, which include uncovering espionage, subversion and dissidence, censorship of all international and selected internal communications, investigating crimes against the state and presenting evidence for prosecution, protecting the borders of the country, providing physical protection for the leaders and important installations of the party and state, and for visiting foreign dignitaries, disrupting and neutralizing the activity of hostile intelligence services and émigré organizations by aggressive counterintelligence operations, supervising the development and installation of secure communication systems, and providing maintenance and security for those systems. The number of KGB personnel engaged in clandestine activity directed against foreign countries is estimated by the CIA at 10,000, while the counterintelligence and security components operating inside the Soviet Union are much larger. With the inclusion of a sizable administrative and support apparatus, the total number of all Union or national level personnel has been estimated at a total of 410,000. Of this total, the border troops have been credited with over 175,000 employees. The Kremlin guards and possibly other uniformed components, while not individually reported, may number over 65,000. In addition to the 410,000 national level personnel estimate, each republic and autonomous region has its own KGB structure, and there are KGB offices in every town of any size across the entire Soviet Union. Section B. Organization and Structure. Subsection 1. executive level. The chairman of the KGB, Yuri Vladimirovich Andropov, is assisted at the executive level by several deputies and by a senior policy. End of page 556, beginning page 557. Making board, known as the, quote, collegium, end quote. This body meets at least once a month to discuss KGB activities. Other officials, such as various specialists and the chairman of the Republic-level KGB organizations, participate in collegium discussions when specific problems are discussed. Subsection 2. Chief Directorate level. The KGB has a highly complex organizational structure, but it is generally correct to say that the first Chief Directorate is concerned with foreign operations, and that the second Chief Directorate has primary responsibility for internal security and counterintelligence. Subsection A. The first Chief Directorate. The first Chief Directorate of the KGB is organized on both geographical and functional lines. The geographic departments are numbered, and the first department operates against the United States and Canada. Traditionally, the numerical designation, quote, first, end quote, has been assigned to the department that operates against the, quote, main enemy, end quote, of the USSR. The United States has been that enemy since World War II, but the People's Republic of China has since been elevated almost to this status by current attitudes, if not by formal organization. The second department is responsible for Latin America, including Mexico. The third department concentrates on the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and Scandinavia. The fourth department on West Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and so on for the 13th additional departments. The functional or specialized components of the KGB First Chief Directorate concern themselves with particular non-geographical targets, types of operations, and types of information on a worldwide basis. There are several important components in this category. The Counterintelligence Directorate works directly against foreign intelligence and security services. The Scientific and Technical Directorate runs clandestine operations to collect information on technological advances and analyzes their application to military and industrial uses. Department, quote, A, end quote, Covert Action and Deception, plans, coordinates, and supports those activities which are known as, quote, active measures, end quote, a name which approximates, quote, covert action, end quote, in brackets. This group was formerly called Department, quote, D, end quote, disinformation, and received extensive publicity in the West in the 1960s under that name, end brackets. Department, quote, V, end quote, formerly known as the 13th Department, conducts assassinations, abduction, and other types of, quote, executive action, executive action, end quote. It is known to have carried out assassinations abroad. Currently, this department is primarily concerned with contingency planning for sabotage and partisan warfare operations. The Intelligence Liaison Department maintains liaison with the state security or intelligence services of the East European communist countries and of other pro-Soviet states. It serves as a channel for levying requirements on those services and for coordinating their activities. While in recent years, increased efficiency and diplomatic considerations have led to variations in the degree of Soviet control of the East European intelligence and security services. The CIA considers the services of these countries to be an effective extension. End of page 557, beginning page 558 of the KGB. The CIA also considers the Cuban Intelligence Service, the DGI, to be effectively controlled by the KGB. Subsection B, the Second Chief Directorate. The primary responsibility of this group is internal security and counterintelligence, including penetration, detection, and frustration of externally and internally supported anti-Soviet activities. All Soviet citizens, all foreign embassies and consulates, and the growing number of foreigners who visit and live in the USSR each year are under its purview. The Second Chief Directorate is broken down into several functional departments, including the American Department, which conducts all operational activity directed at the official representatives of the United States, Canadian, and Latin American governments in the Soviet Union. Its mission is twofold. First, to minimize associations between diplomats and the Soviet citizenry, and to monitor contacts that do take place. Second, to attempt recruitment of American officials. One department is responsible for identifying, investigating, questioning, and maintaining records on all Soviet citizens and authorized and unauthorized contact with the United States officials in the USSR, including any Soviet citizen who wants to visit the U.S. Embassy for any reason. Another section arranges controlled contacts for U.S. Embassy officers during trips outside Moscow. The Foreign Tourist Department controls and attempts recruitment of tourists who visit the USSR through a large informant network within all tourist services, including hotels, restaurants, campsites, service stations, etc. Section C, the GRU. The GRU has a significantly smaller number of personnel in Moscow than the KGB, since it has only one function: the collection of foreign strategic intelligence. Its headquarters is reported to have 2,000 officers. The GRU Chief General of the Army, Peter Evashutin, is assisted by several deputies, as is the chief of the KGB. Also, like the KGB, the GRU has a collegium which examines current problems and proposed activities. The GRU is broken down into geographic components, although fewer than the KGB. Of the 4 geographical components, one is responsible for collection of strategic information about the United States, the United Kingdom, and Latin America. Of the GRU's functional components, 2 deserve mention. One directorate is responsible for signals intelligence, SIGINT, collection. The primary intercept targets of this directorate are the strategic air and ground forces of the United States, Western European countries, Japan, and the People's Republic of China. SIGINT units in the USSR, East European countries, and covert units in the Soviet embassies and trade missions abroad intercept and analyze all types of electronic communications, including encrypted and clear text official messages and telephone calls. Another functional directorate trains Africans, Arabs, Asians, and Latin Americans in organizing underground nets and insurgent movements in their countries. The training is done at camps and bases in end of page 558. beginning page 559. The USSR, and this directorate works closely with the CPSU, Central Committee, which is responsible for selecting the individual students or political groups to be trained. Section D. The scope and methods of anti-United States operations by the KGB and GRU. KGB and GRU officers total approximately 1/3 of the 10,000 Soviets currently assigned to official Soviet installations abroad, excluding military and economic aid missions. Government control of all Soviet trade, business, and media services provides an additional type of cover for KGB and GRU officers. Additionally, Soviet intelligence officers occupied many posts in the United Nations administrative structure and in the UN's auxiliary organizations, such as the International Atomic Energy Agency and the International Telecommunications Union. The number of Soviet intelligence and operations officers is a misleading indicator of the scope of Soviet operations. Many Soviet officers are responsible for many informants or assets who provide intelligence or carry out operations for the KGB and GRU. The main objective of the Soviet intelligence officers, both in the United States and in countries which U.S. installations exist and U.S. citizens live, is recruitment of Americans as intelligence assets. In 1959, Soviet directive, which was reaffirmed as recently as 1975, states that, quote, great attention, unquote, should be given to the recruitment of U.S. agents who have, quote, access to encrypted and other secret correspondence, such as code clerks, secretaries, and typists, end quote. Another objective is the recruitment and cultivation of, quote, agents of influence, end quote, or agents who can influence political events or decisions. Soviet intelligence also mounts technical operations against U.S. installations and personnel. Planting of microphones and installation of telephone, quote, taps, end quote, is done on a massive scale in the USSR and Soviet-oriented countries. The Soviets are more selective in the West, but they do conduct such operations. The primary targets are the officers and residences of U.S. ambassadors, senior foreign service personnel, CIA officers, and defense attaches. Section E. Eastern European Security and Intelligence Services. According to the CIA, counterparts of the KGB and GRU in Eastern European countries serve in varying degrees as extensions of Soviet anti-United States intelligence collection and covert action operations. Of the 8 communist countries in Eastern Europe, 5, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and the German Democratic Republic, adhere closely to the Soviet line, and their intelligence and security services are strongly influenced and, to a large extent, controlled by the KGB and the GRU. Soviet intelligence advisors are permanently assigned to their headquarters, and the advisors have total access to all information collected by these services, as well as to their, quote, sources and methods, end quote, data. The USSR is able to impose collection requirements on these Eastern European services for our information, not, end of page 559, beginning page 560, needed by the country itself. The CIA knows of operations against U.S. citizens and installations carried out by Eastern European intelligence services under Soviet guidance. The other three communist countries in Eastern Europe, Romania, Yugoslavia, and Albania, have attained varying degrees of independence from the USSR, as is reflected by the absence of any significant liaison relationship between their security services and the KGB and GRU. All Eastern European intelligence services concentrate heavily on the American target at home and abroad, frequently under direct Soviet guidance. While these services by American or Soviet standards are not large, in aggregate, the number of officers they have assigned abroad approaches that of the Soviet intelligence services, and they thus represent a significant enhancement of the already formidable capabilities of the KGB and GRU. They continue to exercise tight and political control within their borders. End of page 560. Beginning page 561.